The SKS, or Self-Loading Carbine of the Simonov system, is a Soviet semi-automatic rifle chambered in the intermediate 7.62 by 39mm round. The SKS was developed in the later years of World War II, with some limited testing being done in the field. The rifle saw very limited service in the Soviet Army, as the AK-47 rifle was designed very soon after the SKS and was better in almost all aspects. The SKS saw much more service in the Chinese Army in the form of the Type 56 carbine, alongside service in other Warsaw Pact countries. The SKS is a primarily wooden rifle with an external metal receiver. It feeds from a 10-round internal magazine fed by stripper clips, which can be reused but mostly weren't. It was chambered in 7.62 by 39, which is famously the same cartridge used by the AK-47 and AKM. It was a short-stroke gas piston-operated rifle using a tilting bolt for lockup. It had a folding bayonet on the underside of the barrel. The rifles of World War II were very similar and often the very same rifles of World War I, and was designed based off of rifles of the Napoleonic era. These rifles were found to be far too long and chambered in calibers larger than necessary, leading to excessive recoil. Throughout the war, the fighting countries, most notably Nazi Germany, developed new, shorter rifles in smaller calibers. In the early 40s, from 1942 to 1944, the Nazis developed a series of rifles chambered in the intermediate 7.92 by 33mm Kurz cartridge. These rifles were originally known as the Machine and Karabiner 42, or MKB-42. A variety of variants of the MKB-42 were made until 1944, when the Sturmgewehr 44, or STG-44. The Americans also experimented with an intermediate cartridge rifle, the M1 carbine, chambered in 30 carbine. Unlike with the STG-44, the M1 carbine was never intended to replace the M1 Garand, and instead was issued to irregular soldiers such as paratroopers, officers, mortar teams, and other such soldiers. The Soviets were much slower to adopt intermediate caliber weapons. The Soviets did, however, replace the World War I era M1891 Mosin-Nagant with the M44 Mosin-Nagant, a shortened version of the M1891 with a permanently affixed side-folding spiker bayonet. This rifle was a half step away from the long, high-caliber rifles of early World War II, as it still fired the full-power 7.62 by 54mm R cartridge, which was overpowered for its intended uses. The AVS-36 was another half step away from the M1891. The AVS-36 was developed by Sergei Simonov from the early 1930s, with his first prototype in 1931. It was a select-fire rifle, just like the STG-44, meaning that it could be fired in both semi- and fully automatic modes. It was a gas-operated firearm, just like most modern rifles, and used a vertical sliding block system to ensure the gun wouldn't explode after firing. It accepted detachable 15-round magazines. What makes this a half-step was that it was still chambered in the 7.62 by 54mm R cartridge. Despite being in service from 1936 to 1945, the rifle was, and still is, a rare sight. The vertical sliding lock system was highly complicated, and the rifle was prone to jamming, as dirt could easily get lodged in the action. The AVS-36 also had many issues due to the ammunition it used. It would require high-quality ammunition to function well, which the Soviet government wouldn't be able to afford. Due to it being chambered in 7.62 by 54mm R, it was also completely uncontrollable while firing fully automatic. More rifles were designed as half-steps throughout World War II, notably the SVT-40, a semi-automatic rifle that accepted detachable magazines, though was chambered in 7.62 by 54mm R. The rifle was used widely in service, though due to Soviet supply issues, and the SVT-40 being more complicated to produce, the Mosin-Nagant was still used widely for the entirety of the war. During the later months of World War II, the SKS was issued in small numbers for field testing, and in 1949 it was officially adopted by the Soviet Army. As soon as the SKS was adopted, it was obsolete, as the AK-47 had already begun mass production, and it was chambered in the same 7.62 by 39mm round, but was select fire and had a 30-round detachable magazine, compared to the SKS's 10-round internal magazine. As the years went on and the AK-47 was simplified to be made cheaper and easier to manufacture, and with the introduction of the AKM, the SKS was relegated to reserve troops and second-line troops. The SKS still managed to remain in service with the Soviets until their collapse in 1991, and the SKS is still seen and used by honor guards in Russia in a similar sense to the M14 in the US. The Cold War had begun, and the Soviet Union needed its satellite states in the Warsaw Pact to have weaponry, and thus it shared the technology and design of the SKS with the Warsaw Pact countries and in China, where it saw a much more extensive service history. The SKS saw service in Yugoslavia, Albania, Romania, East Germany, China, North Korea, and North Vietnam, making it the 9th most produced self-loading rifle. These variants were all very similar to the Soviet-made SKS, with the most notable difference being the addition of a grenade launcher on the Yugoslav version and a modified stock on the Albanian version. Some more minor differences between the SKSs of these countries would be found in the charging handle and iron sights, another difference being in the type of wood used. The most notable uses of the SKS were in the hands of guerrilla forces, soldiers who used irregular fighting tactics primarily based on ambushes. These tactics were favored by countries such as North Vietnam and Imperial Japan to devastating effects against the Americans. The Chinese communists spent many years fighting against the Republic of China. This fighting led to the development of the People's War Doctrine, in which the communists would fight by leading the enemy deep into their land, therefore stretching their supply lines. They would then use guerrilla warfare to bleed them dry of their supplies, with not only the People's Liberation Army, the Communist Chinese Army, but also the general populace fighting. There was a unique emphasis on sniping, which the SKS excelled at compared to the AK-47. In 1956, the Chinese developed their own version of the SKS, known as the Type 56 carbine. The main difference between the Soviet and the Chinese SKSs was that the Chinese used a spiker bayonet, as opposed to the Soviet's bladed bayonet. In 1968, the Type 56 was replaced by the Type 63, which was a combination of the Type 56 SKS and the Type 56 AK-47, where by the mid-70s the troops were wanting their Type 56s back, leading to the Type 63 being scrapped and the Type 56 once more becoming the main service rifle in the People's Liberation Army. The SKS's limitations emerged in 1979 with the Chinese invasion of North Vietnam in response to the North Vietnamese invasion of the Khmer Rouge. The Chinese were mostly fighting in the mountains, where the longer range of the SKS was rendered ineffective, leading to soldiers being equipped with a new rifle known as the Type 81, an SKS and AK-47 hybrid, though they soon reverted back to the SKS as the Type 81 had too many issues. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union and China began giving their SKSs to communist revolutionaries. For instance, the Viet Cong, the guerrilla army of North Vietnam, was heavily equipped with Soviet and Chinese SKSs, so much so that the United States, after their intervention in Vietnam, began using SKSs in training, arming the side meant to stimulate the Viet Cong with them. SKSs were also taken back to the US as war trophies. SKSs were also popular in Africa, where they were used by communist insurgencies in Angola, Rhodesia/Zimbabwe, and Southwest Africa/Namibia. Type 56 SKSs were also used in Northern Ireland by the Provisional Irish Republican Army during the Troubles. In Oman, during the Dhofar Rebellion, SKSs were smuggled in by sea, most likely from Warsaw Pact countries, to arm the Popular Front for the Liberation of Oman. SKSs were used in Thailand by the Communist Party during their rebellions in the 80s. During the 83 US invasion of Grenada, Cuban and Grenadian forces used SKSs, with the US Army capturing 4,074 of them. By the 80s, the SKS was growing less and less prolific, even in the hands of insurgents, as the AK-47 and AKM was becoming cheaper to produce, and thus more prolific. The SKS was an interesting rifle, mostly owing to its long service history despite it being a heavily outdated rifle even at its conception. It was an outdated rifle that was used heavily by communists throughout the Cold War, primarily by insurgents, but also by some more major countries such as China. The rifle remains a prolific rifle in the hands of civilians, but now primarily as a hunting rifle in the United States and Canada.